the dictionary definition of a constitution. A constitution must have purpose, and the purpose must be to create a nation that conduces to the greatest happiness of the greatest number of people. That is what a constitution must be. And having set the objective of the constitution, you then frame a constitution to achieve that objective.
Because we really do have a race problem. Those divisions are real. We see it in our politics, we see it in our trade union. We see that they take the divisions with them. Look at where people live in this US. You have enclaves in the Bronx and in Richmond Hill and in Brooklyn. They're taking the division with them.
Women are dying in the streets, and we have a government pontificating running around campaigning for women's vote. No women should vote in this election coming up unless there is something done to the legislation as Magistrate Kim is advocating.
That voices like ours that are not in the political trench fighting it out, voices like ours should become stronger. One of the things about the Caribbean is that we have never had one discourse. Bass will know the days of the New World and the Old World and the radical left and so on. What we had was this concourse of ideas, which I think in the early days of independence pushed us in a certain direction. We have got to move back to that point of having these multiple discourses.
Good evening. Good evening to all of our viewers in Guyana, New York, and elsewhere. Today we have our Globespan show, which is a little different. We have two guests who are well versed in the history and politics of Guyana. We have Mr. Hamilton Green. I'm sure most people would know that Mr. Green was a founding member of the PNC. He was one of 5 vice presidents in the cabinet of Forbes Barnum. He was Prime Minister of Guyana from 1985 to 1992. We also have another Prime Minister from Guyana, Mr. Sam Hines. Sam Hines was the Prime Minister of Guyana from 1992 to 2015. He briefly served as President of Guyana in 1977. So
97.
So just to give our audience a little background in terms of what we're trying to do. We always want to go back to where we started from, right? And how things have evolved in Guyana, because that is the only way we can try to figure out where we are going. So I know there are people who would say, well, you know, that's all in the past, that's all historical. But in the words of Martin Carton, if we don't recognize our history, we're all going to be consumed in our history. So history is a connection to what we do in the future. I've said before, and other guests here have said, that Guyana is going through a trying time, right? This is a very crucial year because, either this year or next year, we're going to have a defining election, right? Defining in the sense that we have the key players who are, in a sense, hardened in their position. And at the same time, we have an economy that is poised to bring us great hope and great economic wealth. And as we look at this, the events that are being played out in Guyanese society today, it is very disheartening, especially to young people. But our two guests obviously have a wealth of information. They have been very much involved in Guyanese politics. They have actually been at the zenith of power compared to the rest of us. So our hope, and my personal hope, is to get as much information as possible from these gentlemen. So we will take a tour back into our historical evolution, and we're also going to plan in terms of what these gentlemen are going to tell us in terms of how Guyana will evolve in the future. So history is important, right? So having said that, let's talk about the situation Guyana is in today. So my first question will be, to Mr. Sam Hines, and then we'll go to Mr. Hamilton Green. The one thing that I want to remind both of you gentlemen is there's only two of you on the show. I am the moderator, so I will guide the discussion. We ask that you, if you can, as best as possible, be brief with your comments. There's enough time for us to interact with each other. And at the same time, I'm hoping that I know you were part of organizations in Guyana, whether it's PNC or PPP, but we would like, and it is my hope, that both of you speak from the heart, and you tell us, how you see things from your perspective, as opposed to, regurgitating, what essentially represents the organization that you were part of. So hopefully we can get that discussion going, because again, like I said, you're both senior politicians. So here's my first question. When you look at Guyana, Guyana is not very much different from other countries, right? People like to say we are a very complex state. Um, I wouldn't say Guyana is approaching a failed nation state, but we have some elements in Guyana that are very troubling, right? Um, if you take a look at other countries, for instance, let's say, I mean, pick a country, Singapore, the newly industrializing countries in Asia. These countries, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and so on, Vietnam, have pretty much developed into vibrant and stable economies, right, since World War II, right? Um, you look at Singapore, for instance, it has a very high GDP per capita. Singapore is dubbed as the third less corrupt country in the world. I mean, that's a tremendous achievement, right? It is an entry port, very highly developed. But if you come closer to home, when you look at a country not too far from us, like Trinidad and Tobago, here we have a country that has been very heavily industrialized. It has the highest GDP per capita in the Caribbean. Um, I know that people will say, well, Trinidad has oil, but Guyana does not have. It did not have oil since World War II. But the point is, Guyana has a lot of resources, right, that could have helped us to develop in the way that Trinidad developed. So I'm getting to my question. My question is this: if you look at a country like Trinidad, for instance, where we have some very common elements, right? Demographically, we're pretty much there. Trinidad's population is probably twice ours. The ethnic makeup is pretty much the same. There's slavery, there's indentureship, right? So there are a lot of things that are similar. So my question is to you first, Mr. Hines. You know, why is Guyana in such a state today where we can't even develop or we can't establish a very stable democracy?
Well, I wouldn't put it the way you have. My point has been that Guyana has had a challenge, first of all, of its peoples coming together. I think we have been misleading ourselves when we say that we are a divided country. The what has been happening in Guyana is that we have been coming together, six different peoples from six different starting points. And I say that I am heartened that when the ideas of partition came up in the 1950s, we didn't go in that direction. Uh, I think there are other things that have been happening. We took a wrong turn. In 1964 period, we took a wrong turn in 68, where the PNC and their supporters resorted to rigged elections with the encouragement of the people in the West to avoid godless communism coming to Guyana. But what happened to our country is that once you take a step to do a small wrong to avoid a potentially greater wrong, you get onto a sliding slope. That's where we've been, and since 1992, and then the things running up to that, the 1990 to 1992 period, uh, we have been turning back. It's been a difficult period of time. The issue now, as we've seen since December 21st, is that we've had an NCM carried in Parliament, and we've seen the leadership of the coalition, and I would stress the leadership separate from their supporters. The leadership of the coalition has been leading in the direction of rejecting the NCM. There are some good, some heartening features in that if that incident had occurred in the 90s, early 90s, Guyana may have had disturbances and protests and so on. We haven't had that. So I would say the population at large has been changing. It's a different population from what it was in the 1950s. And I would say that for all that has been said about the things we did when we were in office, systematically making life difficult for Afro-Guyanese, I would say the fact that things have been reasonably quiet, I think, says that the younger people who really experienced our times, and as the older ones pass away from the 50s, I think that the view is changing. The view is changing, and I'm very hopeful for the future.
All right, so Mr. Green, would you like to comment on that question?
Well, I like to avoid the myopia of my good friend Sam when he talks about the 68 and the period after, except to say, one, I'm optimistic, and two, that I propose publicly, time has come when the two major parties, which for better or for worse, seem, even after the problems of 1954-55, when Apanjat was introduced to this country and divided our people in a very terrible way, I still feel that the two leaderships need to sit down and talk. And I have proposed, I think David Hines supports this, that we work out the modalities for a national front government. I will not go down the path that Sam has and attempt at this stage to apportion blame. I have said that we need to have an amnesty because, look, I've been in this business since 1953 as a young man. We can spend hours blaming the PNC for A, B, and C and the PP for X, Y, Z. I mean, Sam talked about 1968. What about 1961? I was a candidate. The judiciary determined that there was a serious problem with the Houston elections. The judge ordered that by-elections be held. Those by-elections were never held. So I don't want to go down the road of the violence in the 60s.
I would only comment that 1961, we were still a colony under the governor. Mm-hmm. If it is that the impression is being given that it is the PPP somehow got involved in that issue, we were still a colony under the governor, under the British.
So I take it that both of you...
Sam, I was involved. And all that the PP had to do was to agree, as the British government had requested them to do, is to trigger the arrangements for the by-election. So let's go down that line.
So let me just say, from what I'm hearing here, right? Is it my understanding that both of you are saying that the dominant and the most crucial problem that has to be addressed in Guyanese society today is the racial problem?
We have to address it frontally and stop the charade of believing it does not exist. In the 70s, I thought we would have it go away. It hasn't. And even I was speaking to some young professionals 2 days ago, Indo-Guyanese. They admit they don't want this business. When it comes down to the voting time, even in the face of evidence that Party X is corrupt, ABC, they go down that line. This has to do with colonial history, and I repeat myself. We need to recognize that we need a period of healing and national front government where we share the spoils of our wealth.
That is the kind of language that certainly there's real differences between the PPP and the PNC. And that language that was just used about sharing the spoils is the issue. The PNC and its group has been stolen, taken over by an elitist group. And that is how that kind of language comes up too, sharing the spoils. We of the PPP and the PPPC have been much more a group with sentiments from the rural area, and our approaches are quite different, or the way we have seen things are quite different. I concur that we must be able to differ within some boundaries. We must be able to differ within some boundaries, and we must get to a point where the behavior of each of us and the way we see each other allows for us to live with when the other party wins an election. We need to get to that point.
So here's my question now then. How do we get to that point, right? If we all agree that we need to have, whether it's called a national front or a coalition or whatever we call it, how do we get from here to there?
First, I would say you need that for 5 or 10 years so that the dust will settle, and we ensure that, I use the word sharing again, because sharing is the cardinal issue that has bedeviled this country for so long, whether it's a perception or reality.
You know, I think of something I read that a Greek guy had said. You know, that the challenge in democracies and revolutions and so in countries is always how people see each other. Some people think they are better than others, but they're only receiving equal treatment, and therefore they revolt or they create upsets. Our problem, the problem as I've seen it, is that the Afro-Guyanese group in Guyana has been taken over by a group of people, the leaders, their political leaders, who are an elitist group and who have been misleading the large group of Afro-Guyanese. I've been reading in recent times some of the complaints of Dr. David Hines when he talked about the talk about Afro-Guyanese not being sufficiently represented in business. But just think of where we came from. In that same period of 1968 to 1992, Afro-Guyanese were directed to the government sector that at one time was 85% of the economy of Guyana. And then when a lot of Indo-Guyanese weren't welcome into the public sector, and they had to find living in the niches around the place, the private sector niches. When IMF and IDB and the World Bank came and made the changes from 85 onward to 90, the people who had the head start, because the way of the PNC leadership had ended up setting it, were the Indo-Guyanese. But in our period of time, Afro-Guyanese got going too. Many Afro-Guyanese businesses got going in the period of time that we were in office.
Let me ask you a question, and I'm hoping that you gentlemen can come out of your comfort zone, because I have a love for history, and there's a lot of things that I would like to ask both of you. So first, Mr. Hines. So if we are saying that the problem is one of ethnicity and race, right? And we know that. We can see that from the elections, right? So here's my question directed to you, Mr. Hines. One of the things, and you know the PPP well, right?
I don't think so.
The assumption is
Sam Hines is a part of the civic group. Don't forget that. He doesn't know that.
But he is part of the civic group. But he's also speaking here officially, it seems, as a member of the PPP, because there is no formal civic that became part of the PPP, right? So here's my question to you. We have had a racial problem for so many years, and one of the questions that comes up is, why can't these parties become more multi-ethnic? So here is what, and I'm going to and I'm going to say this to you. This is what Mr. Green had said about you, Sam Hines, on a recent show, Facing the Nation. He said, and again, taking into consideration the racial dynamics of Guyana, he says Sam Hines has really no clout. He's just a window dresser. So if it's a racial issue and you were recruited by Chetty Jagan himself from an organization called GUARD, what was the problem with you not being able to bring in? Is it because you are really a window dresser, or is it because you could not bring in Afro-Guyanese? And there are a lot of things Afro-Guyanese have said about you, Mr. Hines.
Yeah.
But you're not representing Afro-Guyanese.
Yes, and I go back
addressing
to
the racial
I go back to my position, and I say that unfortunately for Afro-Guyanese in Guyana, their leadership has been seized, and they have given their leadership to a group of an elitist group, and they have been, in my view, torn in two directions ever since the 1950s, and
but Sam, you're dodging the question now. What I'm asking you, Sam,
is that the question.
If you're addressing the racial problem, right? And the assumption is that, and you're a prime minister, right?
Yes.
How do we make the PPP more multiracial, and how do we convey to Afro-Guyanese that Sam Hines is not going to sell their interests?
Why are you making the PNC more multiracial? Why you see the problem only with the PPP of being multiracial? Why don't you see it with the PNC that they have been the issue with the multiracial thing?
But I have my questions for Mr. Green. I'll get to him in a second.
Coming back to the question of racial problems, again, I would like to say we've been seeing it in the wrong way. We started out by assuming that this thing should happen easily, quickly. But there was a Dave Martin article some months ago, I think it was him, in which he said, look, the issue of race and culture and ethnicity, these things have been developed maybe for 10,000 years, maybe let us say from 100,000 years ago. They've been developed. Different people, different groups of people develop their ways, their habits, their religion, their culture, the way they laugh and smile and marry and bury the dead and so on. And to think that you can just, these group people from these groups can just come together and somebody wave a magic wand and it all disappears. It isn't like that.
Yeah, but Sam,
so
we've had so many years. We've had an entire generation.
We have been closing the gap. The gap is closing and has been closing. And one of the things that happened initially after 1968, it created a situation which put it on pause and even initially started it going back apart. But then
Sam,
when everybody started suffering in the 70s and you had the WPA and Walter Rodney coming along, you then had people coming together again in this period when, whether you're Indian, Kuliman or black man, you are both being hammered by the government and administration.
How are you?
And they started to come together.
But how are you going to solve that racial problem if all three of us are seeing it? Well, let me finish. How are you going to?
Honest.
But here's my question.
Honest and honest.
Okay,
let's
be honest. Let's be honest.
The no confidence motion that happened in December. How could you expect people of the PPP to be honest with people of the PNC when you've seen the behavior we've had, which can only be understood from an elitist point of view, that they believe that they are the people to rule Guyana.
But Sam, here's a question.
And that let me ask you. Motion was passed validly.
Okay, but if your party, the PPP, is on a moral high ground, let's make that assumption. How is it a person like you, and again, I'm coming back to the racial issue, how is it a person like you, coming out of Mackenzie, right? How is it a person like you can feel comfortable in the fact that in cross-examination you have Nigel Hughes questioning Roger Luncheon, who could make an outlandish statement that Afro-Americans are not qualified to be ambassadors? How is it possible for you?
I think you have to go through the whole detail of that questioning, and you must also look and see what was happening before and what happened after. So I think
But
that
how do you mend
you used the
society
word
when
just
those
now.
things?
He came out with an outlandish statement in the course of cross-examining it, and maybe one has to say that Mr. Nigel Hughes has some great abilities too
But I don't recall. But I don't recall you
as
saying
a lawyer.
anything. But I don't recall you
I
saying
wouldn't
anything.
like him to, because questioning me, I might say things that I don't intend to.
But see, that's my
That is
point.
a facile
If
excuse.
we're not addressing the issue and
May
we're
I say something?
complicating more,
Not
I mean,
addressing the issue.
then we're responsible for
If you look and
exacerbating the
see
situation more.
some numbers of persons were made full ambassadors in the period of time, in the course of time. A number of persons were
Sam,
made
you're
who
dodging the question. I'm asking you a simple question. How is it
we would
possible?
have to go back to the case and follow the line of questioning and look and see the specific question that was put and how it was answered.
But the
You
only
have to
thing,
go back through the line of questioning,
Afro-Guyanese will remember
because
is that one single
the
statement, and that
actions
statement alone
before
branded the
and
PPP as a
after
racist organization.
are not consistent with the way that answer is presented.
The answer was
Let me ask Mr.
very clear. The answer is very clear. There's no ambiguity about it. But may I, with respect, ask Sam is obviously speaking from some script he has. Who are these elitists that he's talked about in the PNC? Is it Hamilton Green? Is it Forbes Bonham?
Yes, Hamilton Green is
What
one.
elitists? I'm an elitist?
Yes, Hamilton Green is one.
Sam, I grew up with the people in our boys' town. I've never lost my roots. I've never lost my contacts. People, they love me.
Let us say what happened after
they
2015. Let us look at the things that this coalition
what
administration did from 2015. Let us look at what they did and what they said. They said,
let me ask.
Look, we got to raise our pay because we did getting plenty much more than that. We doubt it, but that's what they said.
Let me ask Mr. Green
then
a question.
Later on, when the question came up about the public service, who largely we would expect supported them, getting the increases in pay that they were told they would get, they were told, look, we thought there was plenty money, but when we gave ourselves the pay increases, they got no money left. You got to hold on and wait. That basically is what happened. And you're asking me about elitists.
I have a question for Mr. Green. Just 1 second. Let me
respond to Sam.
Can you make it brief?
Dr. Jagan who told the Guyana Public Service Union not a cent more. Was that elitist?
No, that was not elitist. That was not elitist. That was not elitist.
What it was?
That was a fact of that the situation was. Up to in the last 24 hours, I heard one of the two gentlemen running for the prime ministership in England said that you have to tell people not only what they want to hear, but you have to tell them things too as they are, things that they need to know. So
I'm going to exercise the moderator's gavel here. Sam, just 1 second.
Just give me a second, please. Put in the very nicest of ways.
A question from Mr. Green, right?
And if you look at the way he did things, he always said when you had trade union problems and so on, in sugar or so, he always said, let us go to the books and see what is possible. Because he was always, in my view, aware that
all politicians are elitists. I have a question for Mr. Green. Right now, you have been saying that you support a National Front government or a unity government. So, is this a position that you recently? Okay, but is this a position you have now taken, or is this a position you've held before?
It's a position that the party held earlier. But the fact is, the PNC had the reform segment, the PP had the civic segment, and it was not real. It did not encompass the majority of people on the other side. I've come to realize after 50, 60 years that in the belly of the two major parties, which split well, in 1954-55, that the cleavages, the suspicions persist, and we have to face this frontally and stop putting on a mask. Look, when the split in the PP came, I was present, so nobody can contradict me. The two major Indo-Guyanese in the PP came out in solid support behind Forbes Bonham. The two major Afro-Guyanese came out in support of Chedi Jagan when the split came. I was present as a youngster. What happened after? I suspect somebody saw that this was not a good sign, and that's where the Apanjat started, vote for your own race. And that has disturbed, destabilized this country since then. Left alone. Look, when the PPP Bonamite went to elections in 1957, Sidney Everson King was the most popular politician on the East Coast. The PNC Bonamite did not feel the candidate to give King an opportunity to be victorious. The PP tried to talk to King, it didn't work out. They put a new person, Balaram Singh Rai, who was at that time, I don't mean any disrespect, a political neophyte. But because the race thing was drummed up, King lost by a narrow margin on the East Coast. That's a fact. And this is the tragedy of Guyana. So I'm saying, let's face the reality. Let's sit down, deal with corruption, have a set of rules that if anyone on either side crosses the line, he must be disciplined and toughed out. You have no time to protect people.
Let me give you a footnote on that. Let me give you a footnote on that event you're referring to. Both Sidney King and Balaram Singh Rai were good friends. After the election was over, they shook hands and they hugged. There were no racial animosity. I can tell you because I wrote the book on Balaram Singh Rai, and I know what happened during that time. But I want to come back to what you said.
There was no animosity.
Yes, I want to come back to what you said, though. You're saying that for us to heal, we have to have this sort of a national front government. But I'm going to share with you two comments you made, and I'm trying to pick your brains and see where we're going with this, right? In 1988, in a magazine called the Multinational Monitor, you made a statement saying that race doesn't matter to us. And again, this is when the PNC was in office, right? You said Chedi Jagan is a spent political force, failing to attract young people, and he's beating the ethnic drum. And again, I'm quoting, right? And referring to the PNC as a minority. Okay, referring to them, let me just finish. You said minorities for years have been trying to meddle in Guyana's elections because there have been many allegations of electoral fraud. But we, the PNC, are democratic. And it is the and again, I'm quoting, it is the only political grouping capable of dealing with our problems. And here's another, I'm going to give you one more quotation and I need you to comment, right? There was another magazine called Diplomacy Magazine. This is more recent, in 2004, where basically you said that the race problem, and I know you're picking a different time period here, but you did say that the racial problem started before that. It started a series of racial events which took place in 1953. But you are moving that date to 57. So my question is, how serious are you about the fact that Guyana needs a national front government, and is the PNC, which is currently in office, you know them very well, right? You were a PNC activist, you were a founding member of the PNC. Do you think, and I guess here's my question, do you think the PNC, which is now in power, is willing, given all the shenanigans that have been happening recently, are they willing to share power with any other political party, especially the PPP, which you seem to be arguing for?
I believe so. I haven't had a survey. I haven't spoken to the leaders seriously about this issue. But I believe the time has come. You know, I happen to be one of the few persons, the late Elvin McDavid, who tried to bring Burnham and Jagan together because they recognized unless these two Leviathans came together, that there was no hope for us. Unhappily, Burnham's demise came in August of 1985, and his successor didn't seem to share those views. Sherry Jagan came to my home with Joey as a witness. I was trying to revive that dialogue, but Hoyt didn't seem to buy it, and that's part of the whole story. But the National Front has to be predicated by stringent, strict rules of conduct so that no one on either side should cross the line and get away with it. The mayhem we had in the early 2000s, the Roger Khan saga, we can't afford that again. Guyana can't be, we've had too much blood. We can't afford it. And pain.
Well, since you mentioned Roger Khan, a quick question for Mr. Hines. You had indicated before, this was a television show that I saw, where you seemed to imply that the problem in Guyana was so severe, given the prison break and so on, and the periods from the early 2000s, right? You seem to indicate, and that's the sense I get from this, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, that it was necessary to actually have a group, and maybe Roger Khan was that group, to address what is called the ethno-political problems. And you've actually written a letter describing, using those terms, saying that it was necessary. And there are many people in Guyana who were PPP supporters, that it was probably important, since the PPP could not control society after the prison break, that it was important to stem the tide of the violence by forming an alliance with Roger Khan.
I think that, as you said there, this impression you got, I don't think that is what I intended to say. I said that I responded to the frequent allegations and the frequent characterizations of the Jagdeo killing era. And I said, and we had that COI about the people who were killed at Lindo Creek. And I said, we should start back in the run-up to the 1997 elections and what happened at the 1997 elections and what happened after that. And it is interesting that recently, with the regretful passing of Andaya, that there were two letters in the papers speaking about her, one by UC, and he spoke about her rejecting the idea that was put that these people had seized Buxton and they were fighting for Afro-Guyanese, and they were appearing on TVs as freedom fighters. And also Moses Bagwan also made another reference to that, and I think UC himself had written something as he left Buxton. So repeating regularly and saying that this was the Jagdeo killing era certainly does not look in any way at what happened in Guyana. And I did say yes, that our security services seem to be having most surprising and unexplained lack of success in detaining these people, that some of our supporters, many Indo-Guyanese, got some people to clash with them. This is what happened. This is what happened. This is as I saw it. It was, and I remember in particular, it wasn't commissioned at all by the government, or it wasn't commissioned by the government. It was not something that was commissioned by our president at the time.
But Mr. Hines, you had 28 years, right, of PNC rule. You had involvement of the army, and there were corruptions charges against the police and so on. Then the PPP had 23 years, right, to address these issues. So the implication is when you ally with someone who has a sort of a paramilitary force, you're now engaging in extra legal
We
means
did
to
not
address.
ally. We did
Why
not.
did the PPP not seek help from the United States, like, allying or seeking help from the, Drug Enforcement Agency, or look to weed out corruption? You had, 50 years to look at and address those issues.
We had 15 years
Well,
to
you had 28
address.
years plus 28 years plus 23 years to fix and address those issues. And now your government is faced with allegations that a minister
Well, I
was
think
involved in
you
buying,
should know.
spy
You
equipment.
would know that the struggle against people going to do evil things, even in the U.S. I read somewhere, they say we know all these people, but you have to have a case to bring them up. There was some time ago the big story about the Teflon Don eventually being caught and so on. So I think you have to be realistic and look and see how these things are. And the issues of drugs in Guyana has its roots back into at least into the 80s, in that very difficult period that we had. In fact, we had a period in Guyana there in the 70s and 80s when business was run on a no funds arrangement. You brought in goods, you didn't have to show where any money come from because the country was totally without any official money. We had a desperate period. I remember being in school, and when you hear about in Vietnam about black market money and black market goods, I remember coming down to Georgetown from Linden and hearing the word that bread is going to be shared out at Graham's Bakery. And those days you worked on Saturday morning, and so after 12 o'clock, and Graham didn't open his front door, he opened the door on the side. And quickly after 1 o'clock, there were everybody in the line, including soldiers, customs officers, and everybody was in the line trying to buy bread, trying to buy some bread then. So we had that situation, and I don't think we've taken account of how our people's sense of what's right and wrong and what's lawful and not was totally compromised. And there's no doubt in my mind that people who develop the lines that smuggle good and necessary things like cocaine for your tooth, for dentists, for your tooth, those people, those same systems were turned or began to be turned and exploited into trafficking. It started since the 80s.
Let me give Mr. Green a chance to respond, and I have a couple of questions for him.
Sam is on slippery ground. We're talking about Roger Khan. He says the PP had nothing to do with Roger Khan, and then he's trying to vacillate and justify it. Roger Khan had a full-page advertisement in the newspapers where he assailed the GDF, the police. In any democratic society, the government would have called in this gentleman and said, what you're talking about, this is either heresy or a completely unacceptable situation. He brings in sophisticated equipment, causes the death of hundreds of young people. Minister Gadraj, I know this case because I happen to know the young man. Axel Williams, one of the swordsmen, goes to buy food by the well, argues with the young man because he doesn't want to pay for his food, because in those days, Gadraj men didn't have to pay for anything. Shoots him, instead of being charged for murder, has the caliber of his weapon upgraded. What can Sam say about that? What can Sam say that the Americans knew?
It was an awful period, and we could speak about things on the other side. Business people who got killed and shot down and all of that. We could speak about all of those things. And I would say that for us to get to a...
Sam, let me get some facts. During that period, police deaths went up by 1,000%. You want to question that? I have the figures.
And the question, and we make the point, we make that point too, that the fine man and his gang and those people with whom many of the leaderships of the PNC were acquainted. Many of those gangsters were involved in attacking the policemen. I went to some of the funerals. I went to the funeral of the soldier that was killed.
You know, as a fan of history,
That's
right?
not fortune.
I know, Mr. Green, you have a great history behind you. You wrote a book about some of your experiences, but I love history and especially Guyanese history. So I'd like to ask you a couple of questions, right? One of the things I'm sure you notice that people have considered you to be the Axeman, AXE, man for the PNC. I don't know if you've heard that before, but I've heard it in the Axeman, AXE. In other words, you were an activist. You were proud. I know you're proud to say you're an activist. So here's my question, and I'm going to quote from Takuma Ogunsei. Right, he does feel, and you've been doing a lot of writing recently, that you are trying to rewrite Guyana's history. And again, as I said at the beginning of the show, we have to understand our history for us to move forward. So here is what Takuma is saying in the Stablet News on March 16th. He says Mr. Hamilton Green is rewriting history in stating that Rodney's death was a terrible accident. It will be interesting, and again I'm quoting, it will be interesting to hear how Mr. Green will respond today to allegations that he was actively involved in the attempted assassination of Joshua Ramsamy, the kicking of a worker who was participating in a strike action, the choking of an Indian member of Guyana store staff. And incidentally, Freddie Kusun had written that he was in the library and he saw you came out of a car and you attacked some of the workers in front of Guyana stores. And again, that's in the internet and that information is there. So what Mr. Ogunsei is saying is that you have a checkered history and you're trying to rewrite Guyana's history. And especially with the case with Walter Rodney, who was a great historian, you know, well loved by the world community. So let me ask you this. If I was to put you in a dimly lit room and attach lie detectors wires on your arm, and I ask you a few questions, how would you respond to them? And again, as a history buff,
I have said publicly, providing a few other people are willing, I am willing and anxious to take any lie detector test. Some of you talk about are completely alien to me. Walter Rodney, I heard of his death when the news came out that he was killed. And I'm prepared to take a lie detector on any of those matters at any time, providing some other people who I would name take a test simultaneously.
Well, let me ask you this. Now, did you have anything to do with the shooting of Joshua Ramsamy?
Absolutely nothing. I don't know who he was.
Did you have anything to do with the killing of Vincent Tika?
Absolutely not.
All right, and you're saying that you had nothing to do with the death of Walter Rodney, even though people have said that you were one of the persons who were very forceful in trying to get Barnum not to or to rescind the position that he was given at the University of Guyana.
The university matter has nothing to do with Rodney's demise, as far as I know. And I repeat myself, I knew nothing about Rodney's death. Absolutely nothing. I'm prepared
but you had said in the media that when you came back from Tanzania, you heard that there were some things about Rodney that were very negative, and you brought that to the attention of the authorities in Guyana. And this has been reported in the media. You're saying there's no truth to that.
No, that's a different story. I was told by the senior person at Tanzania that Rodney had become frustrated and is now opting for violence. And I reported that.
This is violence in Guyana that he was opting for?
This was in Tanzania. And that Rodney was now opting a route of violence. I was told that in Tanzania.
All right, let me ask you one more question, and I want to move on to some current events. And again, I know we're dwelling in history here. Um, One of the things that I know I've read about in regarding politicians in Guyana, I've read about an event in the 1960s called the X-13 plan, right? Which was a plan given the time that we had all the riots in the 1960s. And again, I'm only asking this because I know you're very forefront in trying to find a solution to Guyana's problem, and you have been writing in the press. Your name was mentioned, and this was a plan that was discovered by the police during the riots, right? Regarding a plan that was dubbed the X-13 plan, which was
My name was there.
that's why I want to ask you. The fifth name, actually number 6, says Hamilton Green. So would that actually be the same Hamilton Green I'm talking to, or is this someone else? I'm
Well,
just
there's
asking.
only one Hampton Gray I know in the political arena. The X-13 plan I know nothing of. I've heard about it. I believe it was a setup by some security people, but at that time, the party had to put in place its own security arrangements to protect its party members and to protect Congress Place. X-13 plan again, I know nothing about it. I've heard about it. I don't know where the information came from. Whether it's a
You
just
you've
document.
never read it?
No, I didn't think it was important enough for me to read it.
All right. So let's talk about some current events now. We have currently, negotiations between the opposition and the government to come up with a GCOM chairperson. Now, and again, I know both of you understand Guyana's politics, and I'm hoping you can share with us your opinion. So, Mr. Hines, you first. Who do you think should be or would be, if you can give us a name on
It's
your own?
the it's the LOP. It's the LOP's privilege to call. He has put forward 11 names. The paper says that our president has said he would have no part with 5 of them, I think, and there are 6, and it's our LOP's call, and who knows? I wouldn't want to preempt him or anything of the sort.
But I'm assuming you think that name could come from the 11 names that were submitted by the opposition.
Well, I think as it is now, the Constitution says that and the CCJ has recently upheld that the leader of the opposition would put forward a list of 6 names not unacceptable to the president, and the president should choose one of those 6. And I'm hoping that we will get down that road. That will eventually happen. I know earlier you spoke about the elections either this year or next year. I very much hope that it would be this year. For it to be next year would be a total violation of what we of the PPPC or we and our supporters should expect of the PNC, the coalition and the coalition supporters. I think the supporters of the coalition too have to take a position. They have to take a position too, not just leave it to the leaders like that.
All right, so you're not willing to give us a name because
No.
you've got a lot of candidates in there, and you are not volunteering for that position, I assume.
I wasn't asked. I would be eligible anyway. I'd be partisan, and I'd be a partisan person.
So, Mr. Green, the same question to you. Who do you think? And again, I know, please don't give us the same response Mr. Hines gave us. Who do you think would make probably the best chairperson for GCOM?
It's inappropriate for me on the public thing to mention a name specifically.
Well, I'm taking the
All I
mic
can
off so
say
no
that
one can hear, just
The
me.
president has offered some interesting suggestions.
And you think obviously it should come from one of those suggestions?
Who?
You think it should come from one of the suggestions made by the president?
Well, the list presented by the opposition is similar to the one presented earlier. It's a matter for the president to decide. That's what the Constitution says. That is what convention requires. The way the GCOM is constituted, the chairmanship is extremely important. You need somebody with balance and someone who would weigh carefully all the issues. In the context of Guyana, it is not easy to find somebody who open inverted commas, qualifies or is neutral, not in our environment. And that is the problem we face. And that's why the CCJ is in a box of bricks.
Well,
Because
why not go outside of Guyana? Someone from the one of the other Caribbean states.
that that will tear my inside. I was there when the flag was hoisted on the 26th of May in the morning. And it will tear my inside, even though I am one of those persons who admire the three Bs who met at Dickinson Bay in 1965, Burnham, Byrd, and Barrow. And they initiated CARICOM. I have the highest regard for CARICOM. But in terms of that kind of position, I think we should, unless we exhaust all opportunities, try and find a credible Guyanese, even if that Guyanese may be at this moment resident overseas.
All right. So one question for you, Mr. Hines. If the PPP wins, assuming by a miracle PPP wins the election, do you think there will be a peaceful transition of power? Because you had written a letter talking about January 1998, January 12, 1998, in the press, talking about the riots that occurred after the 1997 election. So do you think there will be a peaceful transition of power?
I think that things have changed. We are not in the 90s. If the events from December 21st were occurring in 1997, Guyana would have gone up in flames, maybe. In fact, I happened to be in the U.S. on that day, and people were asking me what was going to happen. I said, well, I'm nervous here. I'm going to be nervous until next morning because I'm almost expecting there'll be fires and things starting out, and it hasn't happened. So our people have been changing. And going back to my view, which, as I said earlier, I noticed Dave Martin made a similar point, that it takes time for people of different ethnicity to come together. And so my view is that we've been coming together. I would have liked it to have been faster, but it's been coming together. And I think actually our period of that time, our 23 years, I think has restored and even increased the pace of Guyanese people coming together as one people. I think the achievements that we made during that time, our road to we have many buses running down to Lethem since about 1996. 97, we had a big bus. Two, we have many buses going out to Madja every day. So I think that spirit, the Guyanese spirit, is growing, and people only come together and feel themselves as one on the basis of common experiences, enough common experiences, a lot of them having to be happy experiences, but also difficult, tragic, bitter experiences are also in the mix of creating the experiences that bring us together as one, that knit us together. So it has been happening, and I am hopeful that we are on that road. And I would say this period from December to now, the patience that has been shown by all our people, I think is to me a signal that a significant change has taken place in our people.
Well, the producers are sending me a text here saying that we need to wrap up. So what I'm going to do, I mean, I share the sentiments you expressed. I do hope there's a great and bright future for Guyana, especially come 2020 with the oil economy. I mean, Guyana will have the fastest growing economy in the world. So that's definitely something to look forward to. So I'm going to offer both of you, as we normally do on Globespan, a final word. So, Mr. Hamilton Green, would you like to go first?
Well, I hope that the truth will emancipate all of us and that the political parties and their leaders will come to the point where we genuinely put Guyana first and is not mere words. And that, as you heard tonight, you still have leaders, as my friend, who possess a myopia about history and are not prepared to accept reality. On this ethnic thing, we need to face the fact. I've been involved. On my way from a funeral yesterday in West Coast Beach, I stopped at the Dazzle Housing Scheme. I remember the people gave that land they which we consider ancestral lands. I can call him Mr. Lachman Singh. I had to go in and stop it. Today it's a housing scheme. And there are many other examples. So we've got to set rules, obey those rules, and put end to this nonsense about race.
Mr. Hines?
Let me talk to the future. I would say there's a saying, that to whom much is given, much is expected. And so I would say I see the coming of oil to Guyana as a challenge to all of us to make ourselves into the best people that we could be. As someone who lived through the nationalization of bauxite, and that was a big thing, the nationalization of timber, one can be deluded into thinking that, you have the oil here, this is great. But really speaking, it is people who matter and people who are most important. And we're all challenged, firstly, to be the best persons that we could be. That is my lasting comment, my final comment.
On that note, I'd like to thank both of you, esteemed gentlemen, again, to join us on GlobeSpan. This program, as I said before, it's sponsored by GlobeSpan, Mr. Nohar Singh, who is also the producer of GlobeSpan. And again, on behalf of GlobeSpan, I'd like to thank both of you for appearing on the show. And I hope, again, we can see that bright future in Guyana that we're talking about. And again, good night.
Yeah, we have to work for it. We have to work and make it so.
May God bless us all.
Thank you very much.
May God bless Guyana.
Thank you.
Good night, gentlemen.
Good night. Good night. Good night to all.